Reject.
So I want to start off by saying thank you, Ola, for that beautiful introduction. I'm kind of embarrassed, actually. I also want to take this chance to say thanks to the whole Reject.JS family, the organizers, sponsors, the venue, my wonderful co-speakers, of course, and for all of you for coming out today. This is a really awesome conference, so and this can happen without everybody being here. So as Ola mentioned, my name is Geacone-Cruz. You might know me as Anonymous Editrix from Twitter. I'm also with livingstyleguide.org, which is an open source project for creating living style guides as a Ruby gem. A little bit more on that later. I am a product infrastructure designer, linguist, and Japanologist. And so some people aren't always entirely sure what it is that I do, but a lot of what I do is going to be explained or evidenced in my talk today. Oh, there we go. The title of my talk is Perfectly Portable, Japanese Mobile Culture Influencing the Front End. Some people might wonder how I arrived at such a topic. Well, this is an extension of a talk that I gave last March at Upfront. And in that talk, I discussed Japanese web and front end and the factors that influence it and what makes it so Japanese. One of the sections of my talk touched on Japanese mobile phones, also called keitai denwa, and how their growth into a staple of Japanese life in the 90s and beyond shaped the way that Japanese websites and the front end were concepted, structured, and ultimately how they've changed or haven't changed in response to the way that people use them. So today's going to be focusing a little bit more on mobile phones. And this talk is going to focus on the role of the mobile phone in Japan, both past, present, and future. Japan's influence on mobile design and development, the current mobile culture and web in Japan, and the future of Japanese mobile culture as evidenced from the past, and also the new smartphone culture that's cropped up in the last 7 years or so. So what I'd like to do is to start off by getting an idea of what you all know about Japan. Can I have a show of hands? Has anyone here actually been to Japan before? OK. So of those of you who haven't, what's your impression of mobile phones in Japan and how they're used? Any volunteers? Maybe shouts? Big smartphones. OK. Anyone else? OK. So we have some ideas about what it is. But actually, it's not always the way that it seems to be. So here we've got a selection of keitai denwa, Japanese flip phones. I chose the flip phone because I'm a little bit nostalgic for the late 90s and early 2000s when I first went to Japan. And actually, this was one of the first times that I had a mobile phone. I went to Japan in 2002 after completing my grad work. And up until that point, I hadn't really had a mobile phone before. I'd only had one for the last 6 months. I was studying in the US. And at that time, we had those awful Nokias that had the replaceable face plates. And they couldn't really do very much except play one game. And they were really difficult to SMS. And there really wasn't much of a mobile phone culture in the US at that time. But when I arrived in Japan, I saw mobile phones like this, and I saw people actually doing things with them. They were looking at the web. They were writing each other really long emails. Some people were reading novels on their web phones. So to me, that was completely shocking, and immediately I was hooked because this vibrant culture that existed in Japan was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. So to give you an idea of the role of the mobile phone in Japanese culture, let's start with some numbers. Japan has a 95% mobile subscription rate. That's about 134.8 million subscribers. Now, that's a lot. I mean, most countries don't have that kind of subscription rate at all. Of these, 79.7% of the subscribers are mobile internet users, so roughly 107.5 million. That racks up to more than twice the US average for web access on mobiles. This means that Japan is one of the breeding grounds for not only web technology, but also for mobile web. And this is going to become more and more evident as the talk goes on. So how did Japan get there? How did they get such a high market penetration? How did they get people so actively using their mobile phones to access the web? Well, it all starts with a little bit of catch-up on history on mobile web. So let's go back to the 90s. Although the first actually commercially offered mobile web was merged in Finland in 1996 on the Nokia 9000, especially in the 9110 series in 1997, which I'm particularly fond of because it was featured in that awful movie with Val Kilmer, The Saint, if you would remember that at all. This was offered by Sonera and Radiolinja networks. And there was kind of accessible to the sense that like it actually existed and people could use it, but it wasn't something that was part of everyday life until the mobile web boom in Japan. And that happened around 1999. And this happened when NTT Docomo, which is one of the big 3 providers of mobile service in Japan, introduced the first commercially offered browser-specific mobile web service called Imode. This was a revolution because nobody really had such a broad access to the internet from their mobile phone before. It was very much about direct connections to the network. But here they were able to package it within a commercial framework. It was based on CHTML, which was around for a hot minute back then, HDML, which was around for a little bit longer, and WDML, which was around a little bit later and a little bit longer as well. And also proprietary ALP and TLP protocols, which was a huge jump forward because they were able to provide customized content. This happened by actually literally pressing an Imode button. So the button had this little logo there, and it was a button on the phone itself. And you pressed it, and you got connected to the web. And there was a little animation that showed like some kind of connection happening, as if a virtual coupling had happened. And that was a pretty exciting moment because you were wherever you were, on the train, you were at school, you were walking down the street, sitting in the park, and you could actually get some information. The content was controlled by the provider via the Imode websites. So actually, in this case, since Imode was provided by NTT Docomo, NTT Docomo was responsible for developing the websites that the web phone could access. And this allowed for better provider control over pricing and billing because it was applied to both sent and received data packets. And here you see that there's a lot of tight control over the exchange of data, the volume of data control, and they had a really tight lid on their networks, which is sort of an ongoing theme in Japanese mobile providers. And it didn't really loosen up until rather recently, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So you had a phone like this. Here's the Imode screen. You would hit the Imode button, which was often one of the buttons that had an alternate use. Or sometimes there was a little extra button down here, depending on the model you had. What's interesting about this phone is it's a GADAK, which is also a domestic phone. So it's a phone that's produced for domestic use in Japan. And I'll explain a little bit more about them a little bit later as well. So they could have all of these extra proprietary buttons that were specific to the carriers that sold them. So you would press the Imode button, you'd get connected, you'd get to your Imode screen, and then what would happen is that you would actually encounter a screen that looked like this. And this is where you would jump off. In later years, a lot of these screens were actually partnered up with providers like Yahoo, which is one reason why Yahoo is still a massive, massive influence in Japanese web. There was often directly a Yahoo menu that came down. On the left, we have Imode, which was NTT Docomo. And you can see that there's lots of linking happening. You would use the numbers to navigate down through. On the right, we have EasyWeb, which is the similar system analog for AU KDDI, which is another one of the big 3 providers. The third provider was JPhone, which then became Vodafone, which is now SoftBank. And they had something called JSky. I happened to have a JPhone when I first arrived there. It was the most futuristic-looking thing I'd ever seen. It was silver. It looked like a tiny spaceship. It flipped open. It made awesome noises. I could play at least 5 games. Ooh. And yeah, and it was a huge revolution for me. And for a long time, this was my only way to access the internet. And you know what? It wasn't just we. It was pretty much everybody. A lot of providers still followed suit. So we had the EasyWeb, AUKDDI, JSky, JPhone. This put Japan and Scandinavia at the forefront of mobile web usage. And this was long before any web-ready handsets had become proliferated in the US and Europe, as I mentioned before. And this opened up a whole new systematized way for navigating the web on the go. So, as I said, this was mostly the main way for people to access the web. This was before home internet connections were really the norm in Japan. Most people from the 90s on until a lot of points in the mid-2000s, so around 2005 even, a lot of people I knew still didn't have home internet connections. And they would have most of their internet access either at work or at school. And if they weren't there, it was through their internet phone. So that was one of the reasons why Japanese mobile web became such a huge influence. This means that the market traction for accessing web via mobile also became the evolution of Japanese web front end. And this was partially what was actually mostly the point of the first talk. So really, Japan was mobile first before lots of other places. So how did we arrive at such an early mobile first approach? Well, this is through people, practices, and power. Wellman and Haythornthwaite, in their really fantastic research piece, The Internet of Everyday Life, said it really elegantly when they said, the internet is not a system of floating ethereally above societies. It is embedded in the concrete realities of people, practices, and power. And I think that we can all agree that this can be applied to a lot of what happens on the web. And in this case, I'm applying it to mobile web access. So let's take a look at the people that are creating this pillar of power and practices. Let's take a look at the people using mobile. There aren't a whole lot of statistics that are really available for the late 90s. A lot of the white papers, which were brought out by the Ministry of Telecommunications, aren't really that informative about actual statistics about web usage, but more about the concepts of its proliferation. So the first real hard look from a white paper from the Ministry of Telecommunications in Japan is from about 2000. And back then, the average demographic was age 20 to 29. And it broke down to about 44.7% male, and 48.1% female. Fast forward a little bit to 2011, and it's skewed slightly higher. But then again, we have to take a look at some caveats there. Sure, in Japan, mobile web has always been the realm of the youth. Remember that benchmark year for the mobile web is 1997, so these early adopters have grown a little bit older. It's also skewed younger in some ways if we approach 2015. This is partially because of smartphones, but also it's because of price normalization on mobile plans, mainstreaming of increasingly younger kids having phones to communicate with their parents, and the general increasing acceptance of mobile phones as a necessity of our everyday lives. But that said, it's also skewed older. As we all know, Japan has a decreasing population and a very highly aging population. And a lot of these domestically produced phones are marketed to the elderly with special features that make them more useful to them. So they're more likely to actually be able to use the mobile web or to be interested in trying it because of these phones. So in some ways, it's also skewed older. One of the most surprising statistics, though, is that the fastest growing subset of mobile web users is aged 5 years or younger. That's a little bit shocking. This could possibly be because of smartphones. It could also be because parents are seeing them more as a utilitarian tool. And we'll also come back to this point a little bit later. So it's precisely these ways of using the mobile web which bring us to the next apex in this mobile internet trifecta, practices. Before the advent of smartphones, people were either using low-end PHS phones or feature phones, these GADAK. So the GADAK were domestically produced feature phones. They're called GADAK because GADA is short for Galapagos. And if we think about Darwin's theory of evolution, the animals of the Galapagos island had special features that allowed them to survive in their environment. And much like these animals in the Galapagos Islands, these Galapagos phones, GADAK, have special features that are extremely useful to consumers in the Japanese market. And even today, with the huge proliferation of smartphones throughout the world, even in Japan, there's a huge passion for GADAK in these feature phones. They still exist, they're still sold. Maybe the proportion of purchases compared to the overall amount of mobile phone purchases is a little bit smaller, but people still have a really nostalgic passion for it, which is something that I find really interesting. And they're still accessible. They still maintain the networks that people use with those phones to access the web. So who knows, in a pinch, they might come in really handy still. So again, let's remember we're talking about the mid to late 90s when mobile web's really starting to take hold. We might still cling to the image that Japan was the future manifest, and that in mobile web sense, it was, but not in the way that we might have imagined. Most people didn't have internet connections at home, like I mentioned before. So at the start of the mobile web, this was a really big part of their way of accessing information in this new way that was really growing. After the debut of Imode in 1999, by May 2001, more than 40 million Japanese were accessing their internet via their mobile phones on a daily basis. This is opposed to about 4 million North Americans at the same time in 2001. So there's a huge difference there. And again, this is about the time that I went to Japan, so I can really say from my own personal experience that this difference was massive. And it was a bit shocking in hindsight. This number nearly doubled slightly less than 2 years later, according to the Japanese Ministry of Telecommunications. So things weren't really slowing down at all. People were really grabbing onto this. And all of this high-level use led to new innovations, some of which had a lasting impact. So these are some of the things that people were using their mobile web for that have had a lasting impact on how we use our mobile phones today. And a lot of these came out of the ways that people were either looking to use their phones, wanted to use their phones, were naturally adapting their behavior to use their phones without realizing it. Some of these are the mail magazine, which is really like a newsletter. But it was sent directly to your phone, usually as a multimedia mail. It's kind of a proto-blog. A lot of people were using these as a sort of bloggy newsletter, but some companies found a marketing value in this, and they would send it to their customers as a way to advertise their deals or to advertise upcoming marketing campaigns. This also is sort of in the realm of microblogging as well. There was a system that was kind of similar to Twitter, but it wasn't even a formalized system. It was a way of sending SMS messages over networks of multiple receivers. So maybe if you had a network of 20 or 25 friends, you would just enter in all of their numbers as the recipients of your message, much like what we have now with WhatsApp or Telegram with a group message. And you could actually include everybody into these things. And in a really sort of primitive way, this was a lot like Twitter. We also had RFID mobile system payments. So Felica, or something called osaifu keitai. Saifu is the word for wallet. So you could actually use your phone to log payments for things that would either be added onto your mobile phone bill at the end of the month, or in later years, you were able to have it as a separate deduction out of your bank account. This also helped to increase people's attention and priorities towards mobile web security. And eventually, this also came to influence smartphone development for web security as well. Streaming video and television. Now we watch YouTube, or we listen to music, or we have some type of receiver on our phone where we can watch movies or what have you. We don't even think about it twice. But back then, and I even had one of these phones, you literally had the screen, and the screen would flip up, and you could watch TV, and it had a little antenna, and you could watch your TV just like a normal TV receiver. And that was pretty cool. So a lot of these sort of bridge technologies that sort of bridged what we had in analog across to mobile, they existed, they still exist. They're still sort of looked at with a nostalgic eye. And they've brought us into a lot of the technology we have now where we can actually watch videos streaming live on our smartphones. My favorite is QR codes. We've all used them. And they're a uniquely Japanese invention. And I'm going to talk about them in depth in a moment. And then finally, the mobile-first approach, which is really, I think, the lasting legacy of the Japanese mobile culture and advent of mobile web. And these last 2 points are ones that I'm going to talk about in depth next. So let's take a look at QR codes. QR codes, as I said, were a uniquely Japanese invention. They were developed by Denso Wave in 1994. And they were originally developed as a way to tag automobiles during the production process. So as they went through the factory, they could track which stage of production each individual automobile was at. And the reason why they were such a revolutionary invention was that these QR codes were so able to have very dense amounts of data and metadata attached to them. Once they caught up and the industry was able to use them as a regular benchmark, people started realizing that they could also use it to get information across using what were now new camera phones. So this is also the late 90s, early 2000s. So people could use their camera phones to take pictures of the QR codes, and then you would get something called mobile tagging. So this is where you would actually take a photo of a QR code off of an actual physical object, like a newspaper or an advertisement, a billboard, and take the picture, and it would bring you away from the physical world onto the digital world. It's also called hard linking. And this is a really important thing. We may sort of take it for granted now because it's an action we do all the time. People give us business cards with QR codes. We see QR codes at the bottom of advertisements, on flyers for parties. We see them everywhere. We're so used to whipping out our phones, snapping a quick picture. We don't think twice about it. But back then, this was really one of these actions that brought us out of the physical world and into the digital world in a very real way. And I think that the semiotics and the iconography, the feeling, the archetypes of these kinds of actions are really, really telling about how we've come to relate to the digital world. So this idea of mobile tagging and hard linking and bridging away from the physical world into the digital world was a big part of us being able to integrate mobile web into our everyday lives. We use them for everything from V-cards to mobile marketing. After their practical industrial purposes were clearly shown, people started to realize that you could use it to get digital business cards, to market directly to different demographics, because let's face it, everybody was looking at their phones all the time to get that information on the web. So this began the very real integration of mobile web into not only Japanese society of the time, but also into our society as a whole. The next lasting legacy is the mobile-first approach. This may seem kind of like a no-brainer, because we are very mobile-first minded these days. But then again, we have to really think about where it came from. Mobile access outnumbered PC access by a great amount. So mobile sites were given priority by project management teams, by companies who were looking to create their digital presence. So often what would happen is that you would get this really accessible mobile site. OK, it was text and blue linking and lots of tiny image mapping. But at the time, it was extremely accessible. But when you went to their PC site, as they called it, it was really kind of a dead zombie site. It really didn't give you much information. Maybe as a consumer, there wasn't much there you could use. Maybe it was just their address and some information about what the company does. But it wasn't anything that consumers could use to actually access their product. But when you looked at the digital counterpart on mobile, there was everything you needed there to find out where to buy it, where you could use it, how you could use it, where you could find support, any kinds of campaigns or deals that might be coming up for that product. So there was a huge gap between this very utilitarian mobile site and this very sort of dead, almost perfunctory corporate site on PCs. So you could see definitely that the priorities lay on the mobile side of things. Again, the bias towards text and blue linking just simply made it easy for people to see on their mobile phones. Image mapping was also something that made it easier for people to see. But it also turned out that these priorities also sort of started to leak into the PC design as well. So you saw lots of websites that you were accessing with your PC were actually looking almost like the mobile sites if they were ones that had information on them at all. There was also the use of the individual identification number. This is another mobile first. Not so much an innovation, but the way that they used it in order to be able to help increasing tracking. So for example, using the IIN as a proto-cookie for mobile web access. Because remember, there was no client-side scripting at that point with those types of phones. So they were using the IIN as a way to actually make sort of a marker or tag for which individual user was using which kinds of services or visiting which kind of sites. So QR codes, mobile-first approach, I think are two of the largest legacies that are left from that era at the moment. And because of that, a lot of the industry was able to gain a lot of power. So let's look at power. The Imode business model is the foundation of which mobile and digital apps marketing is based on as we know it today. It's so much so that Steve Jobs is said to have based the Apple App Store on the business model of Imode. I find that pretty interesting. There's a lot of emphasis on development. There's a lot of emphasis on developing new ways to deliver content to people, of course. And this set the stage for app-centered technologies that we have now that are mostly found for smartphones. So what does this mean? Well, this means that the mobile web proliferated faster than the home web. This means that mobile first was first in Japan. And it also set the pace and direction for tech and business models later on. So now, it's later. What's going on now? Where is it left to go? I think it's a kind of interesting time for mobile web in Japan at the moment, because there's almost two different worlds that coexist. There's this really wonderfully nostalgic culture for GADAK and all of these feature phones that are still being produced and still being designed, some just for design's sake, some for novelty's sake, some for nostalgia's sake, but a lot of them are also still very much serving a real function. For example, phones made for the elderly, or phones made for small children where parents don't want their children to have too much access to the web, for example, which is a problem with smartphones. So I think that these will continue to exist, and I think they'll continue to serve a purpose. And in fact, for example, a lot of times during disasters like earthquakes, these feature phones can sometimes be a lifesaver. So a lot of people that I know still have both their smartphone and their feature phone as a backup. And I don't think that's a bad idea at all. And of course, people in Japan are using smartphones for all the things we're using them now: social networking, chat, games, shopping, surfing. But now it's mostly on smartphones. I say mostly because people are still using these GADAK, but then again, I don't think those are going to go away. And I think that the advent of smartphones has tipped power, but not a whole lot. I think that what's going to happen is that there's going to be a bit of a flattening of the whole culture. Smartphones are more or less similar, I mean, we have different features, we have different models, what have you, but they're all based on very app-centric technology, whereas feature phones aren't. They're very individual. Each model is extremely different from the last. Each provider has a different array of ranges of handsets available. So I think that the diversity that's available with these feature phones doesn't really play out in the same way in the smartphone field. So I think that there's probably going to be a muting of the market, but I also think that there's still potential for a lot of interesting, maybe more artistic, interesting or artistic ways to design these feature phones. One thing I want to point out is the statistic I want to come back to from before, that the fastest growing subset of mobile web users is aged 5 or younger. This is also a function of smartphones. A lot of parents are using them as educational tools for their children. They're very image-based. Children are able to touch the screens and be tactile with them, which is very important. So it's a bit of a skewed statistic because of the way that people use their smartphones. And I think that in that sense, that's where that generation is going to miss out on some of the advantages of having these feature phones. In that sense, smartphones were kind of slow to penetrate in Japan. And this is an interesting case I wanted to focus on a little bit with iPhone versus Android. The fun fact about this is that iPhone was a bit slow to catch on in Japan because there wasn't really much of a carrier choice. It wasn't available in Japan until mid-2008, and SoftBank, which was Vodafone, which was J-Phone, had a 3-year monopoly on iPhone and iPad retail and contracts before number portability became an option in late 2011. People were really reluctant to change their carriers because if they changed their carriers, they lost their phone number. So people were very loyal to their carriers. And I think this also has another factor in the sense of all of these feature phones and how people would stick with the same carrier and choose their feature phones. But in fact, since number portability's come about, Japan is the only market where Android has actually had a gain of nearly 8 percentage points in the last 2 years. And this is from a survey done by the Kantai Word Panel. And I think that's quite interesting as well because this shows, again, a bit of a tipping into a diversity of app-related technologies for smartphones that wasn't necessarily there before. So it could be interesting to see where that goes. So what are the takeaways about this? Well, early mobile web adoption set the priorities for how mobile web was developed, our mobile-first approach, and how mobile and non-mobile web interacted with each other. It drove the use of innovations like blogs, RFID payment systems, laid the groundwork for streaming video and TV and QR codes and more. Smartphone proliferation has muted the market. So maybe compartmentalization is going to give us a bit of homogeneity. But improving the existing issues in web design as it affects desktop-oriented sites is something that's also gotten better. There's been more emphasis on integration of the two approaches as smartphone-based client-side script-driven use happens. So we'll see that maybe that gap between the more feature phone style websites, which is still very much a part of Japanese front end today, and smartphone style app driven, very flat design sites will start to close a little bit more. And I also hope this means that we'll slowly see an end to these zombie sites, these sites where it's just sort of a perfunctory corporate site for a particular company, and that we'll actually move towards more of the Western style diversity of different websites and mini sites that are available to educate the consumer about products or services. So yeah, I think that's where the future is going to take us. I want to say thank you to everybody who came today, and there's a list of people here I want to thank. Yeah, and I hope that you can see the legacy of Japanese web mobile used when you look at your smartphone, when you use your apps, and that maybe, hopefully someday, you'll work on a project that helps to bridge this gap a little bit more. Thank you.
That was so awesome.